Oh, I'm just a typical American boy from a typical American town. I believe in God and Senator Dodd, and I keep an old Castro down. And when it came my time to serve, I knew better dead than red. But when I got to my old draft board, buddy, this is what I said. Sarge, I'm only 18, I got a ruptured spleen, and I always carry a purse. I've got eyes like a bat and my feet are flat, and my asthma's getting worse.
This is the Vietnam Quagmire, part of the History 1302 lecture series, substrata of the Cold War. This is called a quagmire because quagmire is something that the more you struggle against, the harder it is. The way it just kind of sucks you in. Think of quicksand. You struggle and it gets you deeper and deeper. Well, that's what Vietnam was for the United States. But before it was that for us, it was that for France. France had colonized Vietnam in a time period when it was called French Indochina, starting way back in the 1800s, in the 19th century. And France had controlled it more or less until World War II, when Vietnam had taken over for a little while. France regained control after World War II. But by then, this Vietnamese nationalist movement is out there. And it's this movement of people that want to have their own identity. It's kind of part of the brushfire wars that were spreading all over Africa and Asia at this time period. All these countries trying to find their own way out, their own way to independence. What is our identity? And the Vietnamese didn't want to be part of France. They wanted to be Vietnam. A guy comes to power named Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho Chi Minh's an interesting character. He actually had read extensively of the works of Thomas Jefferson and believed that what he was doing in his anti-imperial war against France was the same thing the United States had done in their anti-imperial war against England in the 1700s. He had come to the United States and asked for their assistance, asked for our assistance, and said, "Hey, look, I'm like Thomas Jefferson. I'm a founding father of my country. I'm trying to throw off the shackles of imperialism. You should help me." But the United States, particularly under President Dwight David Eisenhower, chose to side with our World War II allies. We sided with France instead. Mostly financially, we supported France, although there was some military advisors. It was mostly financial. And we kind of left the French to do the fighting there and to hold off the communists that Ho Chi Minh had found himself allied with once the United States had refused to help him. And that's going to kind of be the way things go until the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu is in 1954. The French are completely routed by Ho Chi Minh and his men. And instead of staying and fighting, the French decided to cut their losses and they abandoned Vietnam to the communists. Well, that's not going to sit well. That's not going to sit well at all with us. And President Eisenhower comes in to try and hold the guard. Remember, we're afraid of the spread of communism. We're afraid that that's going to spread. So what they did is Eisenhower and the United Nations divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, and North Vietnam was communist and allied with China and the Soviet Union, and South Vietnam was capitalist, democratic, and allied with the United States. Ho Chi Minh controls the north, and a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem controls the south. You couldn't have had two leaders that were more different. While they were both ethnically Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh was born and raised in Vietnam. He understood the needs of the people. He came from the people. Ngo Dinh Diem was not. Ngo Dinh Diem was ethnically Vietnamese, but he had been educated in France. He actually spoke French better than he spoke Vietnamese. He was also Roman Catholic in a nation that was predominantly Buddhist. Ngo Dinh Diem was never seen as a great choice for the Vietnamese people. The plan was they were going to have an election. Vietnam would vote for itself, whether to be communist with Ho Chi Minh or capitalist with Ngo Dinh Diem. But Ngo Dinh Diem saw the writing on the wall. it became obvious that Go Dien Jim wasn't going to win his election campaign. As a result, he canceled the elections. We've seen this before. This is going to increase the military conflict between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So this guy Diem is abusive of his people. He instills his own family members in power. He begins to abuse the Buddhist majority in the area. He seems like a francophone or a francophile. He's somebody that's not really Vietnamese, and the people are going to turn against him. And who are they going to turn to? They're going to turn to Ho Chi Minh. The United States didn't like that, particularly President Eisenhower didn't like that. Ike, in fact, dislikes it so much that he sends in troops. And for the first time ever, the United States has troops in Vietnam. They're advisors at first, but they're there and they're fighting. They're there doing everything that a soldier does. We sent in 675 U.S. Army advisors by 1960. And then we get the Buddhist monks' protest. There's a great picture of a Buddhist monk doing what's called self-immolation. What this is, it's where they douse themselves in diesel, they put themselves in a meditative state, and they light themselves on fire. Imagine you're a college student in the United States and you see this. You're already against any concept of war because you know if the war comes, there's going to be a draft. And if a draft happens, you're going to be the one drafted. And now you see this Buddhist monk, this citizen of Vietnam, willing to light himself on fire to get your attention. Think that'd work? It did. This was like the billboard for the peace cause. Suddenly America looked like a bully. And we kind of were. In 1960, Dwight Eisenhower, having served his 2 terms, chooses not to run again, and President John F. Kennedy comes to power. John F. Kennedy is going to be saddled with Eisenhower's war. And Kennedy does not want to be the first man to lose a war, an American war. So he increases the military advisors to 16,000. Now there's 16,000 Americans on the ground, and the draft is in play. He also supports a coup d'etat. He supports Diem overthrowing the elected government of Ho Chi Minh, at least elected in the north. The official election was canceled, but he was the chosen leader. it doesn't work out very well for him. It works out even worse for DM. DM and his brother are murdered on November 2nd of 1963. Just a few short weeks later, Kennedy's going to be assassinated. Leaving Vietnam, the war that was supposed to be Eisenhower's war, then became Kennedy's war, is now Johnson's war. Remember, Johnson, LBJ, was a Franklin Roosevelt style Democrat. Johnson wants America to be this superpower, this greatest power in the world, and he's also not going to let America lose a war. Doesn't want to be that president. Doesn't want that title. In fact, he says here that, this is a quote, "I'm not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went." What he means by that is China, the most populous country in the world, had become communist. He wasn't going to let that happen in Vietnam. So he again increases the number of troops in Vietnam. Americans weren't behind this war. From the beginning, we didn't understand why we were there. Remember, America hadn't been attacked. So how do you sell a war to a nation that doesn't want a war? To a Congress that was pretty divided on whether we should have a war or not? Well, the solution is going to happen in the Gulf of Tonkin. In the Gulf of Tonkin, 2 American destroyers report being attacked by North Vietnamese gunfire. Now we have a situation where the North Vietnamese, the communists in Vietnam, are physically attacking and killing Americans. Nothing gets Americans behind a war faster than dead Americans. So Johnson goes to Congress and he pleads his case. He says, Americans are being killed here. We have to do something. And Americans got behind it and said, Americans are being killed there. You have to do something. Congress hears them. Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions, or Tonkin Gulf resolution, depending on which textbook you're looking at. The Gulf of Tonkin resolutions is often called the blank check. It gave the president the exclusive power to moderate the war, to manage the war. The president could now increase troops, order troops into combat, and he could do all this without going to Congress and asking for a declaration of war. Violation of basic constitutional principles. Congress had given up their right to be the war power. The president had taken that right, and every president since Johnson has taken it. The Vietnam War is up there with the War of 1812 as among the worst fought wars in American history. An unpopular war sold to Americans under some pretty shady ideas. I mean, at least until the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, America hadn't been attacked by the Vietnamese. America itself had not. And there's even some question as to whether the Gulf of Tonkin actually happened. But now we're there. We have troops on the ground, and we're determined to win this war. Or are we? You see, this is not the kind of war that soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines want to be in. This was a war with no territorial goals. We weren't trying to take a territory. We weren't really even trying to defeat an enemy. We were trying to hold back an enemy. We were okay at this point with North Vietnam staying in North Vietnam, and they can stay communist. We just didn't want South Vietnam to fall. As a result, we were acting more like a police action than a combat zone. Our men were out there fighting and dying. But for what? We were fighting guerrillas. We were fighting a people that weren't in uniform. We couldn't tell the difference between a North Vietnamese and a South Vietnamese person. If you don't have pretty uniforms on, how do you know who your enemy is? They were fighting a guerrilla war. We were fighting a traditional, conventional war. U.S. troops were out there in uniform, at least attempting to follow the laws of war. There's going to be some exceptions. But the Viet Cong weren't doing that. The North Vietnamese were fighting a guerrilla, a liberty-grounded guerrilla war. And that's going to make things very hard for us. The other thing that makes it very hard for us is it was the first televised war. In the days when you only had 3 channels, ABC, CBS, and NBC, every night the news came on and everybody watched the news. And the news started carrying a body count. It wasn't enough that we had to see the horrors of war. We had to hear the numbers. And pretty soon we knew the names. Americans were dying, and they were dying in Vietnam. We didn't know why. When Americans started coming home in body bags, we started demanding a different response, what we called a flexible response. And we answered it. Congress said, this is what we'll do, Mr. President. We'll approve Operation Rolling Thunder. Basically what we did is we just started mass bombing Vietnam. The thought was, if we could clear the land with bombs, maybe we wouldn't have to clear the land with bullets. It doesn't work out that way. So new and more horrific weapons of war developed. Napalm. Napalm is one of the most horrific weapons ever developed. It's a gelatinous fuel. And when it explodes, it stays on fire and sticks to everything. The Vietnamese used to say, napalm sticks to kids. And it did. And we saw pictures of it. U.S. soldiers were killing civilians. In most cases, this was being done accidentally. But when you've got a situation where you don't have a conventional enemy, you're fighting a guerrilla, you're fighting in the villages out there. And if those villages are striking your men with mortar strikes and rifle fire, how do you respond? Well, we respond with napalm. The problem is those villages weren't always just the enemy. Sometimes they were the enemy and their wives and their kids. It looked for a little while like we might be able to win this war. Things were turning. Then the Tet Offensive happened. In January of 1968, on Chinese New Year, Tet, the closest I can give you comparison to that would be it's kind of like America's Christmas. It's the big holiday that everybody participates in. And our soldiers, under the leadership of General Westmoreland, determined to kind of take Tet off, assuming the Chinese wouldn't attack. So we left skeleton crews back, and a lot of the men were on liberty. Well, in the early hours, the North Vietnamese attacked. And they didn't attack a little bit. They attacked with 67,000 men at 100 cities. And they were very successful for a little while. Now we're able to turn the Tet Offensive. The U.S. is able to mount enough technology out there that we're eventually able to turn Tet back. But it wasn't played that way in the media. The media pointed out that we were kind of caught with our pants down. America was embarrassed, and America was even more disgusted with the Vietnam War. The anti-war protests got worse. Outside the White House, LBJ had to listen to angry college students chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Can you imagine what that must be like as a president? Johnson, a man who had been very, very popular when he came into office, had dropped from 47% down to 36% by 1968. And then Johnson surprises everybody with the abdication speech. See, Johnson was free to run for another election. Let's remember that when Johnson came to power, he was completing Kennedy's term. So that didn't count as one of his 2 terms as president. People expected Johnson to run again. He's not going to. Johnson sees the writing on the wall. And in March of 1968, he says, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." Lyndon Johnson has abdicated. And the man that's going to replace him is one Richard Milhous Nixon, an old Cold Warrior, an anti-communist, the former vice president for Eisenhower, and he might be even more militant than Johnson was. Johnson comes into power with what he called the silent majority that voted him in, and he believed that this was a conservative group that would support him in the war effort. Well, they supported him in his election campaign, but that support began to fizzle pretty quick as the body count kept going up. Our protesters became more famous. Jane Fonda actually went to North Vietnam and had pictures taken with the North Vietnamese guerrillas. Our soldiers started calling her Hanoi Jane. She was a traitor to a lot of Americans. She still is to a lot of Americans. Nixon needs something, so he starts looking for a new plan. He starts talking about peace with honor. What he means by that is America needs to negotiate a peace. Well, that sounds an awful lot like what we heard from Woodrow Wilson. And we learned back in World War I that peace is never negotiated. Peace is won or peace is lost. And the negotiations go south pretty quick. As a result, Nixon is going to expand the war. We're going to start bombing Cambodia and Laos, 2 nations that border Vietnam. Now, to be fair, the North Vietnamese soldiers were kind of cheating in the laws of war. They were leaving the borders of Vietnam and crossing over into Laos and Cambodia, marching down south and then invading into South Vietnam, attacking and escaping back across into these at least officially neutral countries. But we still have this situation. The President of the United States is bombing two nations that we're not at war with. In Vietnam itself, we start worrying about the jungle warfare and the large number of casualties we have because we just couldn't see the enemy. So we started a new weapon, a chemical defoliant. It's called Agent Orange. And what it does is it kills all the trees. It makes them drop their leaves. Made it safer for our soldiers. Or we thought it did. There's a lot of evidence that our soldiers came back with cancer because of Agent Orange. Chemical warfare had been outlawed by the United Nations since before World War II. Is this chemical warfare? I don't know. The question's out there, though. In 1972, the president sends in Henry Kissinger to negotiate with Lee Duc-Tho to end this Vietnam War. They got very little done. In fact, they argued for 5 months over what size the conference table should be. But it doesn't stop Kissinger from coming back and talking about the glories of this discussion. Henry Kissinger comes back and says, peace is at hand. Nixon got a boost. Nixon got reelected. And then we dragged on the war for a few more years. The war is ultimately going to end. There's going to be a ceasefire in 1973. It's not an official end of the war yet, but it's a ceasefire. The conditions were, well, they weren't great for the United States. The United States had to agree to remove all troops. North Vietnam could leave their troops in South Vietnam. And within a few short weeks, Saigon is captured in 1975. Saigon is renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and Vietnam was united. But it wasn't united as a capitalist democratic republic. Vietnam was united as Ho Chi Minh's country, a communist country. That last domino finally fell. So what were the costs of the Vietnam War? Besides the obvious cost of distrust of the government, there were also 3 million Vietnamese killed, North and South. In the United States, we lost about 58,000 Americans, and 300,000 Americans were wounded. The soldiers that did come back suffered what was then called shell shock. Today we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. U.S. morale was at its all-time low, and America's going to enter the 1970s as a nation that no longer trusts its government, and the baby boomers start to vote against it. And we're still feeling that today. That distrust of government that we feel all the time, the division between North and South, urban, rural, Republican, Democrat, conservative and liberal. I think we can trace it back here to the Vietnam War. This was America growing up.